Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT How to Play video. Today our analyst will be diving into how to play Chug Jug for patch 11.18. For the uninitiated, Chug Jug is the composition name that rerolls for Gragas 3. Even the developers have acknowledged the composition by mentioning it in the recent patch notes. Of course, at the end of the day, it is more of a for fun build than a serious one. But maybe it's becoming more viable than before now that they've buffed Gragas 3 and Karma is slowly becoming viable once again. We'll delve into that question along with the core items, champions, traits, and a general how to play for each stage of the game. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social medias. Alright, let's get back to the video, but before we dive into the ins and outs of Chug Jug, let's first answer the general question. Why play Chug Jug? Frontline has always been an important part of TFT and really any auto battler. In Set 5, we've had plenty of options with Revenants, Ironclad, Knights, Dawnbringers, Brawlers, and Cavaliers. There's also plenty of fantastic individual champions that can tank. So looking at Chug Jug through that lens, it's clear that it's at least viable from the frontline perspective. Gragas has always been a staple early game frontline, not just because of the traits Dawnbringer and Brawler, but also thanks to his ability. When Gragas chugs his jug, he gains damage reduction that increases per star level. At level 3, that damage reduction is a whopping 60%, and that is the source of what makes this composition viable. Added on top of a 60% damage reduction that lasts for 4 seconds is that Gragas also heals with Dawnbringer, gains additional health from being a brawler, and defensive items extend how long Gragas can survive. Basically, Gragas 3 can be the foundational piece of any composition, making it quite flexible, which is rare for a reroll build. As for why to play this composition on 11.18, there's a few reasons. Other frontline champions have been nerfed slightly, whereas Gragas did receive a buff, albeit only to his damage at level 3. Even though Nidalee and Riven are weaker than they have been in the past, they are still viable mid-game options that lead into the late game with Karma and Garen. Karma isn't exactly back to pre-mid-set levels of strength, but she's at least playable as an item carry. But all in all, the defining reason is the value Gragas 3 brings as a frontliner. Now, before we move on, there are a few weaknesses of the compositions to talk about, namely scaling and Giant Slayer. Scaling is always a potential issue for any reroll composition, and Chug Jug isn't any different. While yes, you can attempt to scale by hitting late game champions like Garen and Karma, the fact is you're still dedicating a portion of the mid game to rerolling at level 5, which delays how quickly you can hit level 8. It may not always be a major issue, but it is one worth noting. Giant Slayer is the real weakness of the composition, specifically a weakness of Gragas. Since the goal is to 3-star Gragas, he naturally will have a lot of health. A bit over 2400 at that level, not even factoring in additional ways Gragas will gain health, such as items and the Brawler trait. That guarantees that both variations of Giant Slayer will proc against Gragas, increasing the damage output of the enemy carry against Gragas. And Giant Slayer is quite common in the meta after it was buffed. There's plenty of other nuanced issues we can go over, but the two big ones are definitely scaling and Giant Slayer. Just keep in mind that the goal with any reroll composition is to top 4, which lessens how impactful those issues end up being. With that, we can get into how to play Chug Jug, beginning with core items. As per usual, we need to identify the item holders. Gragas is the key champion of the composition, so you do want to focus on having items for him. But Gragas uses defensive items, which are rarely difficult to procure. We'll touch on some of those items soon, but first let's talk about a few potential carries of Chug Jug. Previously, when Chug Jug first became a build, it utilized Nidalee and Riven as item carries since both were quite strong at level 3. But since then they've been nerfed. In their place there's a few options, one of which is actually Kha'Zix 3. Kha'Zix 3 packs quite the punch and is easy enough to 3-star alongside Gragas. Items for Kha'Zix can be Infinity Edge, a utility item like Hand of Justice or Gunblade, and a mana item like Sojin or Blue Buff. There's quite a few options, though Infinity Edge is the best to ensure his ability does a lot of damage. Looking further ahead, Karma is also a viable option with standard AP items such as Jeweled Gauntlet, Hand of Justice, and Blue Buff. Karma is still a bit up in the air as far as being a viable carry, but keep in mind for Chug Jug, a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by Gragas. That does leave the door open for a lot of flexibility. Just find a champion that fits into the build with Gragas and itemize them accordingly. For Gragas, defensive items are top dog. There's plenty of options here, with general options being Bramble Vest, Stone Plate, Warmogs, and Sunfire Cape. More specific items depending on the lobby can be things like Redemption or Dragon's Claw against AP boards, Ironclad, Renewer, or Knight Emblem if possible, and a bunch of Radiant item choices. Radiant items are the main place where you will be making interesting choices for Gragas, since slamming a couple of early defensive items is easy enough to do. There's quite a few options though, keep in mind Radiant Stoneplate was recently nerfed. Radiant versions of all the items we've already mentioned are perfectly viable on Gragas. Radiant Spark is actually amazing since Gragas is in the front line and will live a long time, and the newly buffed Radiant Locket is a worthwhile consideration. It mainly comes down to what you may need going into stage 4 and 5. The quick version for items is to aim for general defensive items to give to Gragas, plus specific ones depending on if the lobby is more AP or AD heavy. Besides that, look to give whatever carry you're playing proper items befitting their damage type. Fairly simple, as most reroll builds tend to be. Now let's move on to the next section, which is core champions and traits. There's actually quite a bit of complexity to the core composition for Chug Jug. At the heart of it, it's simple, as the most important champion is Gragas 3. But Gragas can be slotted into quite a lot of builds, and that's where the flexibility of the composition comes into play. There's a ton of variations we could cover, but for simplicity's sake we'll focus on a few easy to run versions. Those variations utilize 6 Dawnbringer because it's nice and simple and works well with Gragas. As we mentioned earlier, it was common to see Riven and Nidalee as the main carries. They do still work in the mid game, but we won't be focusing on them as the carry. The first 6 Dawnbringer variation is Gragas 3, Kha'Zix 3, Soraka, Nidalee, Riven, Karma, and Ivern. Ivern can be replaced with an assassin, as Kha'Zix is the main damage source for this variation. At level 8 you'll add an assassin for Kha'Zix or Ivern to provide Invoker with Karma, though Teemo is also a great option. Either Nidalee or Riven can be replaced by Garen too. Overall, this is a quick and easy way to play Chug Jug, though it may suffer from scaling issues. The other variation is essentially the same board, except you focus on Karma as the main carry instead of Kha'Zix. Basically, don't upgrade your Kha'Zix and swap him out for Garen when you can. It's also possible to drop down to 4 Dawnbringer and play 4 Dawnbringer, 4 Invoker with Karma as the carry. The board at level 8 in that case would be Gragas 3, Karma, Soraka, Garen, plus Ivern, Teemo, and Syndra. Since frontline isn't an issue, adding Lulu for Hellion and Polly is great at level 8, or Ziggs if there's a Spellweaver emblem you can give to Karma. There's plenty of other ways you can play Dawnbringer, even Riven 3 and Nidalee 3 can be viable options. It all comes down to how quickly you can hit Gragas 3 and what else you're finding in your rolldowns. Lots of Kha'Zix, Kha'Zix 3. Maybe multiple Ziggs, look to play a mixture of Dawnbringer and Spellweaver. For anyone new to the build, we recommend playing the normal Dawnbringer variations, but be open to adding ways to play Chug Jug as you become more familiar with it. With that, let's switch over to covering each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. The opening carousel component priority should likely be a defensive component such as Chain Vest or Belt. That way you can secure an early defensive item slam when the 2-2 armory comes around, or at the latest on the 2-4 carousel. Keep in mind that Gragas is quite good in the early game, so even before hitting Gragas 3, your aim should be giving him at least 1 or 2 items to boost up his value. Moving into stage 1, look for that Gragas. Alongside Gragas, Kha'Zix is by far the best champion to pair him with, since that will provide Dawnbringer, and Kha'Zix is actually a great early damage dealer. Brawler champions also work well, particularly in early Nunu, which opens the door for Abomination. Keep an eye out for any 1-cost you hit, as rolling for them is possible. Particularly champions like Ziggs or Kalista, since building a board around them is easy with Gragas. Continuing into stage 2, the game plan is the same as every reroll build. Don't level, and focus on minimizing damage taken, aiming for a loss streak if possible. It's definitely possible to play for an early win streak with an early Gragas, but you have to hit Gragas 2 and Kha'Zix 2 with at least 1 defensive item. If your board is a bit weak, that's fine, as loss streaking is normal. And that's really it for the early game. Continue to pick up Gragas when you can, don't level, so you can build up your economy to 50 gold, and begin slow rolling once you do. We do recommend not hard forcing Chug Jug if you're not hitting multiple Gragas by Krugs. While it's still possible to play the composition, it works best when you have at least 3 Gragas by the end of Krugs. If not, simply pivot into playing a more standard mid-game. And now we're into the mid-game with stage 3, where you will be rolling to hit Gragas 3. The 2 styles of play here are slow rolling and going all in. Most commonly, you want to be slow rolling, but if anyone is contesting you for Gragas and you're already at 5 or more of him, going all in down to 10 gold is a viable option. But as said, for the most part, you will be slow rolling. Ideally, you want to hit Gragas 3 somewhere between the end of Stage 3 and early Stage 4. Later than that puts you at risk of being severely outscaled, meaning you will want to roll down your gold until you hit Gragas. Before Stage 3, the game plan is simple. Roll to find Gragas, as well as any other relevant champion you need, such as other Dawnbringers. Play around your Gragas to minimize taking too much damage. Stage 4, as we said, is where you want to be done with rolling. The latest is somewhere around 4 or 5, but ideally you want to hit it earlier than that. So roll down more gold if you're near Gragas 3. At the end of the day, sometimes you won't hit. That's just the nature of reroll compositions. Once you've hit Gragas 3, begin leveling when you can and build the rest of your composition around him depending on what variation you're planning to run, or what champions you've hit already when rolling. There's not a lot else to talk about this composition, but the main goal of the late game is to focus on scouting, positioning, and scaling. Scaling means leveling to 8 and adding relevant 4 and 5 cost champions you hit, namely Karma, Garen, Ivern, and Teemo, but anything you can hit that works in your board is fine to play. The power spike of Gragas as a frontliner is the mid game, so adding extra frontline towards the late game is never a bad choice. There's not a lot of nuance for positioning, but do be wary of having Gragas against bad matchups like easily applied Grievous wounds or in front of a stacked Nunu that may end up eating him. The main concern should be maneuvering your carry in the best possible position, but that varies a lot depending on what your board is. But being diligent with scouting and reposition is always the main concern for the late game regardless of the composition. That's all for today, folks. Overall, Chug Jug is a fun composition to occasionally play when hitting multiple Gragas in the early game. Just keep in mind your goal with this composition is to finish in the top 4, as placing in the top 2 is a bit out of reach for the build in most games. Let us know in the comment section below which composition you'd like to see in our next How to Play video. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future GiantSlayerTV videos. And remember, at dawn, we chug.